Comrades, let me speak plainly. For time and patience are privileges we can ill afford. The chains that bind you are invisible, yet they are real. The handcuffs of poverty, exploitation and resignation are forged in your very acceptance of less than what is justly yours. The system does not fear rebellion, it fears awareness. It does not crumble under attack, it collapses only when its subjects refuse to accept their misery as natural, when they see the truth that the world is theirs to reshape. Observe the world around you. The rulers, those self-anointed masters of wealth and means, profess that inequality is inevitable, that your hunger is your own doing, that your labor is worth only as much as they decree. They dress up domination as merit, scarcity as necessity, subjugation as virtue. And what do they rely upon most of all? Your acceptance, your quiet submission to what they tell you is normal. They have taught you to measure your life not by your needs, but by your capacity to endure deprivation. They have convinced you that comfort for a few and hardship for the many is the natural order, and in doing so the system thrives. Every act of acceptance, every sigh of resignation, every "this is how life is" whispered in defeat, strengthens the fortress of oppression. But take heed, comrades, this acceptance is not inevitability, it is choice, and choice is the weapon of the oppressed. Your labor, your collective power, is the very engine that drives this economy, the very foundation upon which these rulers stand. Without you their palaces crumble, their wealth dissipates, their power evaporates. Yet they live in fear, not of your words, but of your organized, conscious action. Understand this clearly. Capitalism feeds on the normalization of inequality. The worker is made to see bare subsistence as acceptable, long hours as natural, poverty as deserved. Education, opportunity, even dignity are rationed, not to your benefit, but to maintain a hierarchy where the few live in luxury and the many toil in silence. This is no accident. It is the design of those who profit from your obedience. Comrades, the first step toward liberation is recognition. Recognize the truth of your exploitation. Recognize that the hunger you endure is not a law of nature, but a product of a system that thrives when you settle for less. Recognize that your labor, your intelligence, your sweat and struggle are the true sources of all wealth, and that you have been robbed of the surplus you create. And once recognition is achieved, let it be followed by action. Organization is your weapon. Unity is your power. When the workers, the peasants, the oppressed, the silenced masses stand together, nothing can withstand their collective force. Strike at the roots, not the leaves. Dismantle the mechanisms of oppression, not merely its symptoms. Demand what is just, reclaim what is yours, and construct a world where inequality is not tolerated, where acceptance of less is not taught, and where humanity is measured not by obedience to the few, but by freedom, dignity, and abundance for all. Comrades, history is on our side. Every revolution, every movement for justice, every step toward equality has proven that the oppressed, once awakened, can reshape the world. Do not accept what is presented as natural. Do not settle for crumbs while the few feast. Refuse to be numbed. Refuse to be silenced. Refuse to accept less. The system thrives only while you slumber. Let us awaken, let us rise, and let us build a society where labor is honored, wealth is shared, and the people are sovereign. Only then will the chains of acceptance shatter, and only then will the true power of humanity, our power, be realized. Workers of the world, recognize your strength, organize your unity, and act. The time is now, the future is ours. The system we live under is not a neutral mechanism, nor is it a natural order of things. It is a carefully constructed hierarchy designed to perpetuate the wealth and power of a few at the expense of the many. At the heart of this structure lies a subtle but deadly weapon, the normalization of deprivation. When people begin to view inequality, poverty, and hardship as inevitable or natural, the machinery of oppression operates with near invisibility. It thrives not because of overt violence alone, but because it convinces the masses that suffering is part of the natural rhythm of life, that the scarcity they endure is unavoidable, and that the privileges enjoyed by the few are deserved. Acceptance of less is not merely a passive condition, it is an active mechanism that ensures the continuation of a system in which the majority remains subordinate. This acceptance allows the powerful to maintain their dominance without constant confrontation, as the majority have internalized the belief that their position is fixed, that the ladder of society is too rigid to climb, and that their demands for justice are either futile or immoral. When deprivation is normalized, resistance is muted, because the oppressed are trained to question their own worth rather than the legitimacy of the structures that exploit them. The act of accepting less is thus a form of internalized control, a psychological chain that binds the mind as effectively as any material barrier binds the body. The normalization of inequality manifests in countless ways, from the wages that barely cover basic survival to the social narratives that glorify compliance and chastise ambition. When society teaches that it is normal to struggle for food, shelter, and security, while others accumulate unimaginable wealth, it cultivates a sense of resignation among the many. People begin to see their labor as inherently limited in value, their rights as conditional, and their aspirations as luxuries they cannot afford. They are told to be grateful for what little they have, to accept the crumbs of a system designed to benefit someone else. Every time a person convinces themselves that this is the best life possible, that this is what they deserve, they become an unwitting participant in their own oppression. The system, in turn, becomes self-sustaining because it relies on this internalized obedience to perpetuate itself. The very act of resignation strengthens the structures that enforce inequality, making the work of those who benefit from it easier, because they face less challenge, less outrage, and less organized resistance. The consequences of accepting less are not only economic, but also deeply cultural and psychological. When deprivation becomes normalized, communities begin to internalize the belief that success and comfort are privileges reserved for the few, while struggle and sacrifice are the inevitable lot of the many. This belief infiltrates social interactions, education, and cultural narratives, creating generations who see their own potential as inherently limited. Children grow up learning to measure their worth against scarcity, not abundance, and adults become complicit in a system that rewards patience with injustice rather than action for justice. The normalization of inequality thus operates not just at the level of material conditions, but at the level of consciousness itself, shaping the very way people understand the world and their place in it. It instills a subtle fear of ambition, a hesitation to challenge authority, and a reluctance to envision a society where equality is possible, because imagining such a society requires rejecting what has been presented as normal for generations. Furthermore, the system depends on the constant distraction and misdirection of the oppressed to reinforce this acceptance. It channels frustrations into meaningless competition among the working class rather than encouraging collective action against the true sources of oppression. It exploits divisions of race, gender, region, and ideology to keep the majority divided, while simultaneously teaching that poverty and deprivation are the results of personal failure rather than structural exploitation. In this way, the acceptance of less is cultivated not only through material deprivation, but through manipulation of belief, perception, and identity. People are trained to accept inequality as just, to rationalize suffering as deserved, and to normalize scarcity as inevitable. This normalization is both a psychological and social phenomenon, creating a widespread belief that nothing can change, which in turn ensures the persistence of the very conditions that produce it. By internalizing scarcity and inequality, people unknowingly uphold the very system that exploits them. Their resignation, their lowered expectations, their willingness to tolerate injustice all become pillars that support the hierarchy of wealth and power. When acceptance of less becomes a societal norm, the system requires less overt force, less coercion, and fewer visible mechanisms of control, because the oppressed themselves have adopted the rules of their subjugation. Each act of complacency, each acquiescence to hardship, each rationalization of inequality is a building block for the continuation of the status quo, allowing those at the top to govern with minimal resistance. The more the masses accept less, the more durable and efficient the system becomes, because it has transformed the consciousness of those it oppresses into a tool of its own survival, turning the very people who are exploited into enforcers of their own exploitation. The acceptance of less is therefore not a minor or incidental issue, it is central to the survival of exploitation and inequality. Without this psychological acquiescence, the system would face constant challenge and the mechanisms of control would be forced into the open, vulnerable to scrutiny, resistance, and eventual dismantling. But as long as people continue to view scarcity, deprivation, and injustice as inevitable, the system thrives, feeding upon their resignation, reinforcing its hierarchies, and perpetuating its own power with the quiet consent of those it subjugates. Awareness is the spark that illuminates the hidden structures of power, the first tremor in the ground for the quake of revolutionary change. Until the oppressed recognize the true nature of their exploitation, they remain trapped within a world that presents injustice as inevitability and subjugation as natural. To awaken is to see clearly the mechanisms by which the system extracts value from labor, concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, and the endless reproduction of inequality. Awareness is not a passive state, it is an active, conscious engagement with reality, a refusal to accept the distortions presented by those who profit from obedience and ignorance. It is only when the worker, the peasant, the laborer, and the marginalized recognize that their suffering is not a matter of fate, but a consequence of systemic design. The seeds of liberation are sown. The recognition of exploitation is the moment when resignation is replaced by possibility, when the mind begins to understand that the conditions it endures are neither natural nor permanent, but constructed to benefit the few at the expense of the many. Without this understanding, all calls to action risk being empty, all resistance easily quelled, and all dreams of equality remain abstract fantasies. Exploitation is often hidden beneath layers of ideology, social norms, and cultural narratives that convince the oppressed that their position is deserved or unavoidable. Capitalist society, for example, dresses up theft of labor as reward for merit, scarcity as a natural law, and the accumulation of wealth as evidence of virtue. Workers are told that their wages reflect their worth, that their long hours are necessary, and that any dissatisfaction is a personal failure rather than a structural injustice. To recognize exploitation is to pierce these illusions, to see beyond the surface of transactions and hierarchies, and to understand that the conditions of labor, the disparity of wealth, and the limitations imposed upon life are not accidents but deliberate constructions of a system designed to maintain dominance. Awareness requires the courage to reject comforting myths and confront the uncomfortable truth. The system benefits by keeping the majority blind to their own power, and liberation is impossible without first exposing the mechanisms of control. Awareness is inseparable from knowledge of one's own value. Every hour of labor, every act of production, every ounce of creativity contributes to the wealth and comfort of the ruling class, yet the worker receives only a fraction of the value they generate. Recognizing exploitation means understanding this disparity and refusing to accept the division between what is produced and what is received as natural or justified. It is to see that labor is not a personal limitation but a collective strength, and that the surplus extracted by the few exists only because the many allow it. The oppressed must come to understand that the power to challenge the system resides in their own collective effort, that the tools of production and labor themselves are weapons if wielded with awareness and unity. Without such recognition, people continue to participate in their own subjugation, believing that their deprivation is an individual burden rather than a structural phenomenon designed to perpetuate inequality. Furthermore, awareness is not merely intellectual but also practical. It involves seeing the connections between personal struggles and systemic oppression, recognizing that the injustices faced in one workplace, neighborhood, or institution are not isolated, but part of a larger pattern of exploitation that spans society. It allows individuals to connect their experiences with those of others, creating solidarity across communities, industries, and regions. This collective understanding transforms private discontent into political consciousness, turning personal grievances into shared purpose, and enabling coordinated action against structures of oppression. Awareness illuminates the pathways through which injustice is perpetuated, and clarifies the means by which it can be challenged, making revolutionary action deliberate, informed, and powerful. Awaken. SS also dispels the false narratives of inevitability that the ruling class cultivates to maintain dominance. When the oppressed understand that inequality, scarcity, and deprivation are socially produced rather than natural, they begin to reject the stories that convince them to accept their suffering. They recognize the strategies of manipulation, the use of ideology to obscure exploitation, and the way in which power thrives on ignorance. Each insight becomes a building block for resistance, each revelation a step toward dismantling the mental chains imposed by centuries of domination. Awareness transforms despair into agency, passivity into initiative, and resignation into a demand for justice. Finally, awareness is the foundation upon which all revolutionary action is built. No movement, no uprising, no transformation can succeed without a population that understands the nature of their oppression and the sources of their power. Awareness is the ignition that turns latent discontent into organized struggle, the lens through which injustice is made visible, and the compass that guides collective action toward meaningful change. It awakens the mind to the possibilities of freedom, the reality of exploitation, and the necessity of solidarity, providing the intellectual and moral clarity necessary to challenge entrenched power and pursue a society based on equality, justice, and human dignity. Labor is the engine of society, the source from which all wealth, progress, and civilization flow. Yet under the current system, it is systematically stripped of its true value and meaning. Every building, every machine, every product of industry, and every advancement in science our technology is ultimately the product of human labor. The worker's hands, mind, and time are the instruments through which value is generated. Yet, those who perform this labor are rarely the ones who enjoy its fruits. Instead, the system of capitalism appropriates this wealth, funneling it into the hands of the few who own the means of production, while the vast majority are left with mere subsistence, long hours, and the illusion that their toil is their only contribution. To understand labor as power is to recognize that those who perform the work that sustains society are not weak or powerless, but in fact the foundation of all economic and social life. The capitalist class may control property, capital, and institutions, but without the daily contribution of the working masses, their wealth and influence would collapse. This realization alone begins to shift the balance of perception, revealing the worker as the true source of societal strength and the capitalist as the beneficiary of extracted labor. The power of labor is not merely theoretical, it is demonstrable in every strike, every act of resistance, and every moment when workers withhold their labor to assert their rights. When labor stops, the wheels of commerce halt, production ceases, and the infrastructure of society is exposed as dependent on those who are often invisible within its systems. This demonstrates that wealth is not inherent in ownership or in the accumulation of capital. It is created, sustained, and expanded through human effort. The workers' labor, when organized and united, transforms from a personal activity into a collective force capable of reshaping society. Recognizing this power requires rejecting the narrative that labor is inherently powerless, that work is simply a duty or obligation imposed by necessity. Labor is power precisely because it is the source of value, and when wielded collectively, it becomes the means through which the structures of dominance can be challenged and dismantled. The capitalist system obscures this reality by fragmenting labor, isolating workers, and instilling competition among them. Each worker is made to feel as though their contribution is small, replaceable, or insufficient to matter in the broader scheme. Yet the strength of labor is cumulative. It is amplified through solidarity and organization. When workers unite, they no longer act as isolated individuals competing for survival, but as a collective force whose influence is undeniable. Strikes, unions, cooperative movements, and political action all demonstrate the latent power of labor made visible. The refusal of workers to accept exploitation in isolation may seem insignificant, but when they act together, their collective power threatens the very foundations of capitalist control. This is why the ruling class fears unity and why the system invests heavily in division, distraction, and the suppression of collective consciousness. Labor in isolation is productive. Labor in unity is revolutionary. Understanding labor as power also entails recognizing that the current distribution of wealth is a direct product of labor's exploitation. The surplus value generated by workers, the difference between what they produce and what they are compensated, is appropriated by the owners of capital, creating the vast inequalities that define society. Every luxury, every accumulation of wealth is ultimately the result of labor that is undervalued, underpaid, or unpaid. To see labor as power is to expose this theft and to understand that the authority and privilege of the few exist entirely on the foundation of the many's labor. This recognition transforms perception into action, for once the worker understands the value they generate, they also recognize the potential to reclaim what is rightfully theirs through collective effort. Collective organization is the bridge between labor's latent power and its practical force. Individual discontent is impotent against entrenched structures, but organized action can disrupt supply chains, halt production, challenge policy, and reshape economic relationships. The history of social movements, from early labor unions to revolutionary uprisings, demonstrates the transformative potential of workers acting as a united force. When labor recognizes its central role in the creation of wealth, it gains leverage over the systems that exploit it. Strikes, boycotts, and coordinated resistance are not mere protests. They are demonstrations of power, revealing that the sustenance of society is inseparable from the labor of the majority and that the capitalist class depends on compliance rather than merit. Ultimately, the concept that labor is power shifts the understanding of societal dynamics. It reframes the worker not as a passive participant, but as the core of all production, the essential component without which wealth, governance, and social order cannot exist. Recognizing this fact is the first step toward dismantling capitalist dominance, for it illuminates both the source of the system's wealth and the key to its vulnerability. When workers organize, educate themselves, and act collectively, they move from being exploited laborers to agents of transformation. Labor becomes not just a means of survival, but a means of liberation, a tool through which society can be restructured, inequality challenged, and justice reclaimed. Capitalism presents itself as a neutral system, a natural order of economic life, yet in truth it is a meticulously designed framework that perpetuates inequality at every level. It teaches society to accept scarcity as a law of nature, long hours as an inevitable part of existence, and poverty as a personal failing rather than the result of structural exploitation. From birth, individuals are socialized to see deprivation and struggle as unavoidable, to equate their labor with their value, and to internalize the idea that wealth and comfort are privileges earned by a few, rather than rights due to all. This normalization of inequality is no accident. It is a mechanism of control that ensures the system's survival. By convincing the oppressed to accept these conditions, capitalism reduces the need for overt force, allowing the few who hold wealth and power to dominate through ideology, policy, and cultural conditioning rather than through constant confrontation. The system thrives not through the consent of the powerful alone, but through the internalized consent of those it subjugates, who have been taught to see deprivation as natural, struggle as personal, and inequality as inevitable. Scarcity, one of the primary tools of this system, is systematically manufactured to justify hierarchy and control. While resources, labor, and wealth are abundant, in reality, capitalism frames them as limited and competitive, creating a culture in which survival is pitted against survival. Workers are told that there is not enough for everyone, that their needs must be rationed, and that their satisfaction comes only after the accumulation of wealth by others. This narrative masks the truth that scarcity is socially produced to maintain power structures. It ensures that those at the bottom are dependent, preoccupied with meeting immediate material needs, and therefore less capable of challenging the systems that exploit them. Scarcity is not a law of nature. It is a design choice of a system that relies on fear, competition, and deprivation to maintain its hierarchy. By convincing the majority that resources are limited, capitalism justifies exploitation as necessary, oppression as unavoidable, and privilege as deserved. Long hours are another symptom of this constructed inequality, presented as the natural rhythm of work and life, rather than as a strategy to maximize profits for the few. The normalization of overwork keeps laborers exhausted, distracted, and compliant. When the majority of people are forced to devote the bulk of their waking hours to production, their ability to reflect, organize, and resist is diminished. Work is framed as an individual obligation, a moral requirement, and an unavoidable responsibility, rather than as a mechanism through which capitalists extract surplus value. The long hours of labor, framed as necessary for survival, become a subtle form of control, conditioning workers to accept exhaustion, stress, and deprivation as part of normal existence. In reality, these extended hours are a calculated element of capitalism's design, intended to maximize output while minimizing challenge to the system's power. Poverty, the most visible manifestation of inequality, is often misrepresented as a failure of personal effort, morality, or intelligence, rather than as a predictable outcome of structural exploitation. Capitalism shifts blame from the system to the individual, teaching the poor to internalize responsibility for their deprivation, while celebrating the wealth of those who profit from exploitation. Poverty is not an accident or a natural state. It is the product of policies, economic structures, and social norms that allocate resources, opportunity, and education unevenly to maintain control. By normalizing poverty, capitalism ensures that the majority accept their marginalization as inevitable, discouraging collective action and reinforcing the dominance of the few. The acceptance of poverty becomes a form of ideological control, as people learn to view inequality as an unchangeable feature of existence rather than a product of conscious human design. The normalization of inequality under capitalism extends beyond material conditions into the social, cultural, and psychological realms. Ideologies are created to justify hierarchy. Social status is linked to consumption, and success is equated with conformity to the rules of a system designed to concentrate wealth. From education to media to law, institutions are structured to reinforce the belief that inequality is natural, inevitable, and acceptable. These cultural reinforcements make exploitation invisible, teaching generations to accept the status quo without question. By embedding inequality into everyday consciousness, capitalism protects itself from disruption, as the oppressed themselves become guardians of the system's legitimacy, defending norms that benefit the few while oppressing the many. Recognizing that scarcity, long hours, and poverty are designed rather than natural is essential to understanding the mechanics of capitalism and the ways in which it maintains dominance. These conditions are tools, deliberately constructed to maintain hierarchy, extract surplus value, and suppress collective power. To see them as natural is to participate in one's own subjugation, to internalize the structures that exploit labor and concentrate wealth. Understanding that inequality is manufactured opens the possibility for resistance, consciousness, and transformation, as it reveals the true source of injustice and identifies the levers through which systemic change can be achieved. Action and unity are the lifeblood of any meaningful struggle against oppression, the forces that transform awareness and discontent into tangible change. No society has ever been reshaped through passive observation or individual frustration alone. History demonstrates repeatedly that only through the collective mobilization of those who share common interests can entrenched systems of power be challenged and overturned. The oppressed, when acting in isolation, are vulnerable to manipulation, distraction, and fragmentation. Yet when they unite around a shared understanding of injustice, their strength becomes formidable, their demands cannot be ignored, and their capacity to transform society becomes evident. Action without unity is fragmented and fleeting, while unity without action remains an unfulfilled potential. Together, they form the engine of revolutionary change. Conscious resistance is essential because it ensures that action is purposeful, strategic, and directed toward dismantling the mechanisms of oppression rather than merely responding to its symptoms. It is not enough to recognize injustice or to express frustration. The oppressed must organize, deliberate, and act with the awareness that their collective power is the primary force capable of reclaiming rights and reshaping society. The necessity of unity stems from the structure of the systems that dominate and exploit. Capitalist, feudal, and authoritarian regimes alike rely on division among the masses, using social, economic, and cultural distinctions to prevent collective action. Race, gender, religion, region, and occupation are manipulated to create rivalries and mistrust, distracting the oppressed from recognizing their shared interests. Action without unity is easily neutralized, co-opted, or punished, as isolated efforts cannot challenge systemic control. The power of the few is amplified precisely because the many remain divided, preoccupied with internal conflicts and personal survival rather than organized resistance. Unity, therefore, is not merely desirable, it is a strategic necessity. When individuals recognize that their struggles are interconnected, that their exploitation is not unique but part of a broader pattern, they can coordinate their efforts, amplify their voices, and increase the effectiveness of their resistance. Solidarity transforms the isolated strength of individuals into the collective power capable of confronting entrenched systems of oppression. Action on the oath. A hand is the manifestation of awareness and unity into concrete reality. Awareness alone, without implementation, risks stagnation or despair, and unity without execution risks inertia. Action converts potential into force. It translates knowledge of exploitation into challenges to its structures. Historical examples of strikes, protests, revolutions, and social movements demonstrate that organized, coordinated action can compel those in power to negotiate, reform, or relinquish authority. Workers withdrawing their labor, peasants occupying land, citizens demanding justice through collective protest, all these are expressions of the principle that the oppressed can assert their power when they act together with intent and determination. Such action is not random or chaotic, it is the deliberate exercise of collective strength, informed by the recognition of systemic injustice and guided by strategic understanding of how to leverage mass participation to create tangible change. Conscious resistance distinguishes meaningful action from impulsive or symbolic acts. Resistance becomes transformative when it is guided by clear objectives, shared principles, and coordinated strategy. Without consciousness, action risks being diverted into inconsequential or counterproductive endeavors that leave the fundamental structures of power intact. Organized resistance requires education, dialogue, and planning. It demands that individuals understand both the sources of oppression and the mechanisms by which collective action can achieve change. It is this deliberate, conscious approach that transforms resistance from mere protest into revolution, from individual dissent into systemic transformation. Conscious resistance ensures that action is not reactive but proactive, addressing the root causes of exploitation rather than merely mitigating its immediate consequences. The combination of unity and action also fosters resilience in the face of opposition. Systems of power are rarely passive. They respond to resistance with repression, coercion, and manipulation. Individuals acting alone are vulnerable to intimidation, co-optation, and isolation, but collective action strengthens resilience by providing mutual support, shared resources, and coordinated strategies. Unity cultivates courage, solidarity, and persistence, ensuring that resistance can endure beyond initial setbacks and adapt to changing circumstances. History demonstrates that sustained, organized action by unified groups is capable of achieving victories that seem impossible from the perspective of isolated individuals. The oppressed, by acting together with awareness and intent, can not only reclaim what has been taken from them, but also reshape the structures of society itself. In essence, action and unity are inseparable components of the struggle for justice and liberation. Awareness alone illuminates oppression, but it is through organized collective action that illumination is converted into tangible change. Disunity, passivity, and isolated effort leave systemic power unchallenged, while unity without action leaves potential unrealized. Only when the oppressed recognize their shared strength, organize their efforts, and act with conscious intent can they reclaim their rights, dismantle systems of exploitation, and transform society. Action and unity create a feedback loop of empowerment. As collective efforts achieve results, awareness deepens, solidarity strengthens, and the capacity for further transformation grows, demonstrating that the liberation of society depends entirely on the organized, conscious power of those who produce, sustain, and inhabit it. Comrades, the truth is undeniable. The system survives only because the oppressed accept less as normal, remain unaware of their exploitation, and allow division to weaken their collective power. But knowledge is liberation, and awareness is the first step toward reclaiming what has been stolen from us. Your labor is the source of all wealth, and when organized and united, it becomes a force no system of domination can withstand. Capitalism thrives by making scarcity, long hours, and poverty appear natural, but we now know that these conditions are deliberate, imposed and maintainable only through our inaction. The path forward is clear. Recognize your strength. Awaken to the reality of exploitat. Ion, and act together with conscious purpose. Only through collective organization, relentless resistance and solidarity can we dismantle the structures of oppression, reclaim our dignity, and build a society where equality, justice and freedom are not privileges for the few, but rights for all. The moment of hesitation is the ally of the powerful. The moment of unity is the beginning of revolution. Rise, act, and organize, for the world does not change for those who wait. It changes for those who refuse to accept less, who see through lies, and who wield their collective power with courage and determination. The future belongs to the awakened, the united, and the uncompromising. Comrades, our strength lies in each other, and in that strength lies the power to transform the world.